combat, flight, simulators. Every so often, I get the itch to want to revisit them, particularly as I feel those released on systems from the 1980s and 1990s were great in balancing the complexities of what a sim requires against being approachable for typical players. Something I feel is greatly missed with more recent efforts. But instead of going back to one of my favourites on a home computer, I couldn't help but scratch the itch this time by going for one I've been wanting to try out. EA's F-22 Intercept, released for the Mega Drive in 1991 as one of the first games in their short-lived EA Air Force line. Yet, for all the hype in simulating a fighter which had barely entered proper development, this one kind of ends up being a little anachronistic. When starting the game up, you're first tasked with picking a difficulty level. Each successive level increases the game speed, enemy aggression, and on the hardest, enables collisions with the ground. Funnily enough, you can tweak these parameters once you're in game. Hitting the B and C buttons on the controller reveals an option screen with many options you can set. Though, I never really bothered doing so, if I were being honest. There was little need for me to adjust these beyond what was offered already. And besides, with some of the technical hitches you'll see a little later on, I felt keeping ground collisions disabled was kind of valuable. With that out of the way, it's time to pick what you wish to partake in. F-22 Interceptor offers 3 gameplay modes: entering one of 4 campaigns, partaking in the Aces Challenge, or constructing your own challenge using the mission editor. The mission editor is used to create a once-off scenario to fighting. First, setting the number of waves you wish to encounter, then configure what they're made up of. It's worth noting there's only one wave configuration you can set, so it's about making one big challenge to survive however many times you set it to happen. Another big challenge comes from the Aces Challenge. Here, you'll engage in head-to-head combat assignments against enemy aircraft, using only your guns. So success here is learning about how to wrangle your F-22 in order to get off the first shots against your rival before they try to take you down. Initially, you'll be fighting enemies one-on-one, and once you've beaten an ace in each of the 4 fighters available, you'll face 2-on-1 engagements. Once those are cleared, it's time for the ultimate test, a 4-on-1 engagement featuring an enemy ace piloting one of each aircraft available. You do have one little thing on your side to equalise the odds. Between each round, you'll be fully repaired and rearmed, ensuring you're fighting fit and not completely at a disadvantage against your opponents. Sadly, there's no scoring here, meaning the ultimate accomplishment is really just to defeat that final wave playing on the toughest difficulty. And once you've done that, there isn't really enough variety to make you want to go back and do it again. But that's where the campaigns come in. As mentioned earlier, F-22 Interceptor offers 4, 1 based in the US for training, and 3 set in various hotspots common at the time. Once you've selected one, you'll be given a briefing on the current situation, then an overview into the friendly and hostile assets in the theatre, and boom, it's time for takeoff. As we enter the campaign, it's time to admit that this is the point where F-22 Interceptor starts to shed some of those simulation trappings. Each of its campaigns consists of some 20 to 30 odd missions, and it sounds like a lot at first glance, but, well, let's just run through the opening of the Korean campaign and watch how it all ticks over to see what I mean. Firstly, you need to take off from the carrier. Just hold down the A button to apply thrust and pull up once you've gotten enough speed. Next, we jump to an engagement with a lone enemy fighter. Fire a missile away, and they're toast, and that step is done. Our third bit is to take out an enemy base, specifically a pair of buildings. Launching a couple of Maverick air-to-ground missiles makes short work of these, at least if you want to stay clear of the anti-air defences, rather than getting up close and risking damage from those. Next, our fourth section is to engage a pack of enemy fighters. This really puts your piloting skills to the test, especially if you've been knocked about already and damaged or running a little low on ammo. With these fighters cleared, next you need to rendezvous with a fuel tanker for a bout of mid-air refueling. This is only one leg of the entire campaign, but you can see how the basic structure is set up here. Each of these little sections is what the game calls a mission. Now, I don't necessarily think it's a bad design choice, because it does keep things broken up nice and cleanly. Also, maybe it's just me, but the transition which happens between missions gives me those Wing Commander vibes similar to using your autopilot. Sometimes though, it makes for a strange sense of continuity. Some missions end with you landing on a carrier, but the next transports you to a ground air base for takeoff, or the other way around. Now, this sense of continuity, and lack thereof at times, kind of happens with your weapons as well. It's not entirely consistent when you've been resupplied. And so sometimes, especially later on, you might not have enough ammo to complete an objective. Meaning you might have to do something drastic to get a fighting shot. I wish there'd been a little more attention given to this. The consistency would have been great in just progressing the narrative of the campaign a little further, but also to help convey the state of things for the player around their weapon supplies. This leads into another of F-22's trappings, its lives systems. Though you get passwords letting you resume a mission at a later stage, you don't have the saved pilot records offered by computer-based simulations. Instead, you've got 4 lives to complete a campaign. Should you get taken out in battle, you'll need to restart the current mission, but as a nice bonus, with your weapons restocked. Having a second, even a third, or maybe a 4th chance to retry a mission is way better than having to restart an entire campaign should you fail battle. It needs to be said though, the biggest departure for F-22 Interceptor is with the flight modelling. I was always going to expect some semblance of fantasy here. I mean, this is a game about a secretive aircraft in development after all, at least at the time of development. It's just, the way it presents air combat is quite different to how the real aircraft experiences it. Missions tend to take place at close range to your targets, both in the air and on the ground. This also necessitates that you're flying at far slower speeds as well. The real F-22 is known for its supercruise, the ability to breach the speed of sound without engaging afterburners. And this also experiences a complexity because you bleed a lot of speed when turning hard, which you're going to need to do when dogfighting with enemy fighters. Perhaps this is all just a side effect of trying to squeeze the complex controls for a simulator onto the 3-button Mega Drive controller. Its default configuration has you pitch and roll using the D-pad, with the A button used for applying thrust. The B button fires whatever weapon you've currently selected, and the C button will fire your cannon no matter what is selected. It also has a few combinations to use as well. Holding A and pressing C drops decoys when enemy missiles are inbound. Holding A and tapping B changes your current target, which is rather handy when the game's automatic target selection gets in the way of what you're trying to track down. And of course, we've got the B and C combination, which brings up those simulation option screens. There is one big sticking point with the weapons firing though. What weapon you have active. In other simulators, you typically have a single weapon selected, whether it's your plane's cannons or its missiles. As you track a target, you'll select what you need to engage in, and this typically determines when you're marked as having a lock or in position to fire. With F-22 Interceptor though, your cannons always take precedence. Now that would be fine if you were engaging at extended ranges, but as you're typically not, it means the guns override your selected missile, preventing you from knowing if you've actually got lock before you fire. So if you're using air-to-ground missiles like the Mavericks or TOWs, that's okay, because these are manually guided when fired. Though the auto-targeting might get in the way and select something else, meaning sometimes you have to be extra diligent when you fire them to make sure you are pointing at what you actually want to take out. But it's a real problem with those aerial targets, as without a lock tone, you don't actually know if you've got lock before firing. And if you're not careful, you might just waste one of those precious missiles. And this is kind of endemic of the difference between a simulator and a game. In the former, you need all the information possible to make the right judgment calls. Which enemy to prioritize, what weapons you're going to use to engage them, and what you need to focus your attention on as things get more hectic. In a game, you don't really need anywhere near as much information. And that really carries over here into F-22, as not only does this apply for offensive purposes, but defensive ones as well. As the warnings you get when enemies are positioned behind you, or others are firing missiles at you, are usually in the form of text, alongside speech clips. Your instrumentation doesn't really offer much value here. In fact, outside of your targeting displays and weapon indicators, most of what you see in the cockpit view doesn't really have much use. Now, sure, there's the occasional cutscene which plays when a missile gets fired at you, when you fire one at an enemy, but it's not consistent at all, usually only the first time it happens. And it happens to take valuable time away from engaging in invasive maneuvers. And I don't know about you, but for me, that's a little more important than the spectacle of a missile launch. And so what this leaves with me is this sense that F-22 Interceptor is a program which is trying to step into two different realities and doesn't really fit in with either. It wants to be a simulation experience on one hand, but realistically it's limited by the Mega Drive hardware and control capabilities. It doesn't have the CPU power that a PC of the time would have, and really, you can see this happening in-game, where there's a lot of slowdown happening, even when there's not that much happening on screen. And I'm sure this is what contributed to these tighter engagements and smaller mission areas. But from a game perspective, it tries to introduce some uncomfortable jingoism, and aims for an experience that doesn't really represent what the F-22 was designed for and how it's actually used in operation. Now, I don't think that latter point would bother me if this game was less F-22 Interceptor and more F-4 Interceptor. I think some people might interpret this as being a fairly harsh critique, but I didn't mind it. I think it's more the case that it doesn't necessarily set out what it wants to do. If you're wanting to scratch that Top Gun infused itch, then something like Afterburner is going to be a better fit for you, especially whilst you're humming Danger Zone as you play. But for the simulation fans, Realistically and unsurprisingly, you're best finding something to play on a PC or another computer as a result. But if you are wanting to take to the skies on your Mega Drive, then realistically, I think the port of F-15 Strike Eagle 2 nails the process in translating a reasonably complex PC-based simulator for a console. Granted, that's a game that doesn't aim for hardcore simulation. But for a game which was released during the heyday of microprose, it nails the balance between simulation and approachability pretty damn well. Plus, it also happens to run quite a bit better than F-22. Likely a result of this port being based on those made for the Amiga or Atari ST a couple of years earlier. Ultimately, if you can suspend a little disbelief and you're patient enough to handle the slowdowns and technical hitches, F-22 Interceptor may in fact bring some aerial joy into your life. Which makes it as good a time as any to wrap things up. If you've enjoyed the episode, consider the usual things, liking the video, subscribing and turning on notifications and all of that. Also, do go and check the video description for more ways you can help support the show and be part of the little community here. But other than that, there's not much else for me to say, but to thank you all very much for watching.